Welcome to the Media Roundtable Industry Edition, where we dive into the secrets of the craft of audio and provide our perspective on industry topics. We are, of course, in service of marketers responsible for the success of an audio program. There's about 400 of you walking around on the earth, but we put a lot into this this content production because what you do as a marketer has massive implications for a growing and important industry that we all care about very much. You are the Chief Audio Officer, and so this is for you. I am your host, Dan Granger, CEO and founder of Oxford Road. We've got an all-star team today on the program and a lot to cover. We have, of course, the media queen, Kristen Duenas, joining us. Welcome, Kristen. Glad to have you today.
Thanks for having me back.
We always are happy to have Giles Martin, who we were petitioning for a long time to get to come on the show. He wouldn't do it. He fled the country and the continent. James Cridland was able to come from across the ocean, but Giles was very hard to pin down. So we're very grateful to have Giles Martin with us today. Welcome, Giles.
Thank you for having me.
And of course, the man who speaks to advertisers directly, the man who works directly with some very important chief audio officers in the industry on behalf of our client services at Oxford Road, Ricardo Martinez. Welcome, Ricardo. Glad to have you back on the program.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And James Cridland, we didn't think we were going to get today, but he showed up. He has, in fact, flown all the way from another continent to join us, and he's in Los Angeles. He's not in the room with anybody today, but he's going to be keynoting at the Podcast Movement Conference here, which you may be listening to this podcast as you're driving in to hear James speak, hopefully, if you're listening right on time. But James, thank you for making time, and you're probably feeling great off of a 30, 40-hour plane trip. How did that go?
Well, it's all good. I was in Germany last week and Oslo and London, and now I'm in LA. I couldn't tell you what time of day it is, but apart from that, it's all good.
Yeah, nobody's paying attention around here. Well, welcome to the show. As I mentioned, we got good stuff to cover today. LeBron's got a show that's come out. Caitlyn Jenner and Lamar Odom have a show that we're going to talk about. Amazon Prime is moving into video podcasts. The Ringer has unionized and forced AI protections into their contracts. And we have an election bump that's not happening among news podcasts. There is a lot to talk about, and I'm excited to break it down with everybody here. So listen, before we do that, since James and Giles, you were both in Munich for radio days, which is kind of interesting that anybody's still putting radio on the title of their conference. What can you recap for us? Those of us that couldn't go to Munich, what did we miss?
Well, I suspect James and I are going to have quite different takes on this because coming at it from a sort of advertiser, agency, and brand perspective, I had a slightly different take from James, who was pushing advocating the point of view that the US still has a lot to learn from the rest of the world, or potentially may have. And I think that that's absolutely true when it comes to, content production and sort of the ecosystem.
Manners.
Generally. Very much so. Thank you. But from an advertiser perspective, I felt that, it's funny you call that out, Dan, about them still having radio in the title of the show. I mean, it did to me feel very much like a radio industry coming to the audio era, and they said as much, really, in a lot of the sessions that we went to. There was, for example, a session on the Sunday about how to advertise in podcasting, and I had to restrain myself in my chair from get up and taking the mic from the presenter. But I mean, overall, I thought it was a really interesting set of sessions. I think that the market out there is very hungry, and I think that they're doing a lot of really interesting things. There was a lot of content about the future of the industry in the car and radio's role in the car, about the sort of drip feed loss of Gen Z listeners and what can be done to sort of reconnect with Gen Z. And I think just from a selfish perspective, as an Oxford Road rep, it was great to just network and connect with some more people out there on the ground in Europe. James, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I would probably agree with that. I mean, I think that session that you were talking about in terms of Gen Z audience and how radio can get that back. The write-up that I saw of that said, and I'll share exactly the whole thing. Firstly, we need a strategy. Strategies are good. Secondly, we need to use technology. And thirdly, we need to follow the trends. So that was 45 minutes of everybody's life we're not going to get back. Look, I think it's an interesting event. It has been run for the last 15 years or so. I think I've spoken at every single one of them. It is very much a radio conference, and I think when you have a look overseas at different podcast markets, you can spot the markets which aren't necessarily as developed by how many radio reheated radio shows are in the top 10. And I think from that point of view, there are some markets in Europe which are still not that developed. There are still a lot of radio things in there. I'll point out that in the UK, there isn't any reheated radio in the top 10. And I think that says a lot about how how advanced the UK market is. But yeah, it was certainly a creator conference more than an advertiser one.
Interesting. And James, I'm going to put you on the spot here. If you think about the kind of blended average of outside of the US audio, what year is it like outside of the US in US terms? Is it 2015 out there? Where is it in the development?
Wow, there's a question. What I asked a couple of weeks ago is I asked Will Page, who used to be the chief economist of Spotify, I asked him to do a little bit of work on how much money podcasting was making outside of the US, and in comparison to the US. And actually, it shows that podcasting is really missing a trick outside of the US. For example, if you look at if UK podcasting earned the same as the US per listener, then it should have a $279 million industry. It's only got a $61 million industry. So it's bringing in 22% of what it should be bringing in. Australia is doing rather better, although Australia has rather fewer people, and so on. So I think, the US is most definitely earning the most amount of money in terms of advertising. And it's been very strange over the last couple of days when I've been here in LA, listening to some of my favorite shows and hearing ads in them. Because normally in Australia, you don't hear any ads in anything because nobody bothers to actually sell it. So it's been quite weird to actually hear ads in stuff. But yeah, so I think, in terms of that, the rest of the world still has an awful lot of catching up in terms of ad selling. In terms of creative stuff, maybe that's a different conversation.
Understood. Thank you for that. It was an impossible question to answer, but you did brilliantly anyway. Ricardo, let's go to you for a minute to kick off our first story. Sounds like we have some breaking news that for the first time ever, there's a podcast hosted by a celebrity that's being released. What happened here?
Well, it was just announced that LeBron James and JJ Redick are launching a new show called Mind the Game. It's a basketball-centric podcast produced by Uninterrupted and 342 Productions. This is a game or a new show that is being launched without any actual sponsors ready to participate from the very get-go of the show. It's going to be about 45 minutes in length and is going to be basically available on YouTube and across all major podcast platforms. So it's a pretty big deal. I mean, LeBron he's a superstar. People talk about like he's better than Michael Jordan, like he's a superstar in basketball. And there's an Angelino, sometimes we refer to him as King James. So it's very exciting. The fact that they're launching without a major advertiser is a little bit shocking, but I kind of get the sense that JJ Redick like heard that LeBron was into it and just like ran with it and said like, let's lock this in. Let's get him to commit stat, you know?
So
So
do you
that's
feel
kind
like
of,
that was user error, that they just didn't get it together fast enough? Or do you think it's strategic? Maybe they wanted it not to be so commercial. Does that feel strategic to you, or does that seem like
well, I think it
they
could be a
didn't do it yet?
combination of them. I think, you know, when you get someone of LeBron's stature, you definitely don't want to flop right out the gate. And from some of the initial clips that have been released of the show, it's this very detailed, technically intense content. I mean, it's literally LeBron talking strategy, talking plays, correcting plays, saying this is how the game should be played. You know, in soccer, we talk about, you know, the beautiful game, and people like dive deep into soccer culture and soccer strategy and really kind of live and breathe soccer. And incidentally, LeBron actually owns, I think, Liverpool Football Club. So he's got a little bit of experience there. So I get the sense that LeBron is really diving deep into basketball in a way that really I don't think I've seen before. Now, I'm not a huge basketball fan myself. And so to me, it also feels like, you know, if you're going to do such a deep, intense dive, and that's what the clips that I've seen so far have, you know, you may not have such a broad audience. So I don't know if perhaps they just want to see what kind of audience they get before they commit to advertisers, or whether, you know, this is going to be just like a gangbusters hit right out the gate. I think that kind of remains to be seen.
Honestly, when you think about how they're approaching this, it's almost like the Kelsey brothers' New Heights. They came out, I don't even know if there was advertising yet. If there was, it was really minimal. And then it kind of blew up. And with the names like the Kelsey brothers, like that just got bigger and bigger and bigger until you threw, you know, Taylor Swift in it. Now it's just massive, right? LeBron comes in with a huge name already. So I think we're going to see a lot of that same trajectory. The Kelseys kind of dive into, you know, the relationship. Obviously they're brothers, but they go into the football, they go into, you know, everything that's happening on the field. And that I think will translate not directly, but similarly with basketball. So I think you're going to see that celebrity mindset with the basketball embraced as well. So I think, you know, in time, we may see it do exactly what the Kelsey brothers have done.
You know, in some of the clips, they were sitting there talking, and they were actually pouring a glass of wine. And I think LeBron's actually pushing a little wine on JJ Redick. And if they keep that conversation up and they're drinking their wine, it may actually get a little bit looser, a little bit more casual. And I think that's where the potential is for this to be a really big hit for most advertisers. Otherwise, I think it may just be a little too nuanced and a little bit too targeted. But, you know, I think it remains to be seen.
Well, I'm waiting for one of the two of them to start dating Taylor Swift, and then we know it'll
for sure
really rise on the charts. But I like hearing a couple things for the sake of the industry. I like hearing that they're actually trying to take a unique approach and kind of talking about this, how the sausage is made. I think some of the best things in podcast are when you can reveal a side of a subject that other media channels don't really provide a platform for. And I think that's when podcast is at its best. The other thing is, even though opportunistically, do I wish we could write them a low ball offer to be the first sponsor, you know, on behalf of one of our clients in the show? Of course, but I respect the fact that they may have done this strategically and had the discipline to not try to get the money first. Because what happens is somebody puts this thing out into the world and immediately starts hounding all the advertisers saying, you got to get in, you got to do this. It's going to be massive. We're going to guarantee this many downloads. And they don't know what it's going to do. And we don't know how they're going to get there. And so like having the self-control to say, we're just going to start making a product and make the product good and worry about the monetization second, shows that maybe this will be one we're talking about in a year's time. So we'll see. Now, I do have that question about the next topic, Kristen. Tell us about this other show that's coming out. And is this the type of thing you think will be around in a year's time?
Oh, well, so celebrities and sports figures and more celebrities. So Caitlyn Jenner and Lamar Odom are teaming up for a new sports podcast, according to people.com. That's interesting. On Tuesday, the former in-laws dropped the trailer for their upcoming series, Keeping Up with Sports. Sports obviously being part of both Caitlyn Jenner and Lamar Odom, Lamar being former Laker, Caitlyn Jenner being a former Olympic athlete. So there's definitely sports there. And then there's the nod to the Kardashian family's hit E! show, Keeping Up with the Kardashians, which did end in 2021. So both of these these people are former athletes. Both of them are former Kardashian family members. And now they're teaming up with a sports podcaster, Zach Hirsch, for Keeping Up with Sports, which will apparently see the award-winning hosts take on all sports, each with a unique personality and opinion. If you're asking for my personal opinion, I'm kind of asking why. Both of these figures are at least slightly polarizing. I think that they're capitalizing on their connection to the Keeping Up with the Kardashian franchise. I think they're late to the game in doing so. Lamar Odom hasn't really been in the public eye for a while. Caitlyn had that failed governor of California run during the special election. I don't know really what we're going to see here when it comes to quality of content. I don't know that this is one where I would want my clients necessarily to be first in. I think we would need to take a wait and see approach on what the downloads look like once they equalize, and really kind of what brand safety looks like in a few months as well. I'm very much hesitant on this one.
Yeah, I think my gut tells me that access to these celebrities and like just like their network of people that they know is just going to make this kind of an interesting show. I mean, in the long run. And when I say that, I think it's going to be a show that's going to really resonate with advertisers that really care about those lower CPMs, who are really kind of the direct response advertisers. Like, I don't think this is going to be something where they're going to be able to set like a $50, $60 CPM and like make it work. It's really going to be kind of a nitty gritty kind of approach. I also think that I'm concerned about well, particularly with Lamar Odom, I'm a little concerned about his interview capabilities. I know that I've seen him recently on some reality TV show where he went back to college, and it was kind of a fun TV show. But part of what he talks about is how, he hasn't fully recovered from some of the brain damage that he suffered when he overdosed. So it's just generally a show that, like, being a celebrity doesn't mean you're a good interviewer. And just because you have access to quality talent, which, from what I've heard, their first episode's going to drop with like a pretty big boxer. It doesn't necessarily mean that it'll be a good content in the long run, but there could be legs. I mean, people are interested in celebrity culture. It just needs to be priced right.
I feel like sports has become the new true crime in podcasts, where it's just like people realized, hey, it's a genre it's not going to get terribly brand unsafe. You kind of know what it is going in, and it keeps driving results for advertisers. But it seems like the trend may get so hot that it gets a little oversaturated. And I know this isn't the last time we're going to touch on this topic, but are any of you seeing the same thing? Just a massive influx of sports content right now, kind of over-indexing the rest?
Yeah, I think we're definitely seeing that there's more and more sports podcasts coming out. Largely, there are networks that are kind of aggregating all of them because some of them are so targeted and niche and small. But now that the celebrities are getting into the space, I think you're definitely going to start to see that genre grow. And to your point, like true crime, it's going to be where it's just, okay, yet another one. So which one do we choose?
It sounds like we choose LeBron. That's what it sounds like here. But we'll have to wait and see. I mean, I think it's a good thing, and I like what some of the networks are doing, where they're aggregating local team coverage, because I think local is such a big opportunity for podcast. And as traditional local media dies, radio days, they can call it radio twilight, because we know where it's all kind of headed, but it's got to be reborn as something. And what we're finding is what the business model is for a local coverage in this new platform, but it hasn't really hit critical mass yet. So I'm very bullish on the localized team regional networks and shows that are coming out. We'll see how much room there is at the top for famous people that want to be Joe Rogan. TBD. With that, I want to talk about a small company. They sell books online. They're called Amazon, and they have this service called Prime, where you get all these extra bells and whistles if you pay them a small annual fee. One of those is a lot of content with Prime Video. So the announcement is that Prime Video is now going to be distributing some podcasts via Wondery. 6 trophies with Jason Conception. I might butcher these names because I don't know anything about sports, but Shea Serrano, Over the Top with Michelle Beadle and Peter Rosenberg, and Alternate Routes with Trey Wingo and Kevin Frazier. So they're hoping to broaden the audience reach and make it a little more accessible to sports enthusiasts via Amazon by using that platform, which is very interesting, I think, because so much is going on with YouTube. There's so much conversation about what's a podcast. Is it a podcast if there's a video? And is every podcast going to be a video? But you have a very different approach here. And James, I'm going to ask you to weigh in on this first, but I just want to frame it a little bit to say that, it really seems like Amazon Wondery is taking more of an HBO approach to content, and the way that they're approaching, turning it into video seems to be really less about just getting everything in and up and more about how do we really snipe for the highest quality content and, make it more than just a different version of what they can do on YouTube. But very interested in your point of view here, James.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of a number of things that Wondery has been doing with Amazon's video platforms. But back in October of last year, they put 3 different channels onto Amazon Freevee, which is the free live TV thing within Prime Video. There's the Wondery channel, a Wondery Sports channel, and a true crime channel, which they call Exhibit C. And that essentially means that you've got these 3 channels that appear alongside the EPG, alongside the, in the TV guide, alongside all of the other content which is available on that platform. And I think it's just purely a marketing thing. It's just purely a way of getting more eyeballs onto that content so that you then search it out. And there's actually been a pretty good example from the UK in terms of radio here. If you look at radio in the UK, pretty well all of those radio stations are carried on the TV platforms as well. So you'll find all of your favorite radio stations hidden away in the TV guide. That gets around 3.7% of all radio listening in the UK in terms of share of time. But obviously what it's doing is it's getting radio into a new room in the house, because typically we don't have radios in our front room, in our living room. So there is that, but also it means that it's reaching a whole set of new people. It's a bit like having a billboard, really, more than anything else. So I see it just as being another marketing play. It's great that Wondery have made their stuff available on new platforms, and I think that makes a bunch of sense. Whether or not it'll drive an awful lot of consumption, that's a difficult question, I suppose.
Do you think they're being a little more protective on what they put up on that platform?
I mean, I suppose if they've only got 3 podcasts which they've visualized into a good experience, then that's probably the reason why. I'm sure that they would love to throw as much of their content on as they possibly can do. But my guess is that they've just got those particular shows which are in a format which they can actually put onto the Amazon Prime platform, and that's basically where it is.
And do we know if it's gated there and cannot be accessed through any other channel? At least the video version.
Yeah, that's a good question. So far as I'm aware, yes. I mean, it's purely only being produced for those particular services. I don't think that they are putting everything onto YouTube as well. But
it's interesting. It's interesting to watch Wondery's approach we're seeing Spotify shift their strategy in real time, where they just went from, hey, we're going to gate it. You have to come to us to get it. And then they redid all their contracts and said, just kidding, we're going to put it everywhere. And, now we're getting a wave of reports about Joe Rogan's real reach or total reach now, and, things like that. But Amazon seems to be saying, yeah, we see that strategy. We're going to go a different way. at least with some of our premium content.
I mean,
So-
it might just be a vote of confidence in like how many people already have a Prime membership, right? And I mean, they have invested pretty heavily. I mean, on video, they did launch Thursday Night Football, so we're back to sports. But I mean, they really they've got the membership, and it's basically they can print money at this point with all the subscribers that they have.
Yeah, I mean, the press release says, and I think that this is the phrase which probably explains why they're doing it. The inclusion on Prime Video, it says, will give sports fans an entry to timely sports conversations from some of the most prominent and unique voices in sport. So it's an entry into. So I think it is just purely a way of marketing their shows so that people will then open up, ideally, the Amazon Music app and have a listen to the shows in there.
Well, we'll see. Let's stay on the subject of sports, shall we? Giles, semi-related to sports, you've got some info on the Ringer. What's going on there?
Yes, they have just finally ratified their new contract with Spotify over the last couple of weeks, with a union deal, which has secured better pay, better terms, better severance, and most interestingly, I think for us, protections against AI misuse. And there's some very interesting nuance here. The employees have to give their consent if their voices are going to be cloned or credited, or they need to be credited on AI content. But for translation purposes, Spotify have got the agreement to allow them to automatically translate their voice into other languages without any explicit permission. And I think that that's really interesting. And I mean, just to finish that thought, I mean, they've pushed hardest for the translation capabilities, at least that's how I read it, because that makes the most sense for them strategically. Of course, we know that as a business, there's no margin for them in their music business, which is why they've been investing so heavily in spoken word. And this is, instant ability to scale that spoken word content, more profitable scaling of spoken word content, very rapidly across the world. And James just talked about some of those gaps in some of these other markets where the amount of advertising lags so significantly behind the amount of listening. And my thoughts went to Latin America, which I think we talked about on a recent episode, where the amount of listening is going to surpass the listening in the US next year. But the actual size of the advertising market is, still below $100 million. So it makes a lot of sense, because this is going to give Spotify the opportunity to rapidly open up new markets and monetize new markets. And it's unsurprising to see them leading in this space.
As I think about this, there's a couple of things that come to mind. Like, first off, whenever we talk about unions and my boss is on a call, I always say, oh yeah, I hate unions. So Dan, don't worry about it. Even though I actually love them. I think they're great for everyone. That being said, I think it's a no-brainer, right? Anytime that you're going to be the voice, you want to make sure that you're protected, right? You're ultimately, these people are talent, right? They're not just a random chatbot. So it makes sense that this union contract included protections for them. When it comes to the translations, though, I mean, I'm not surprised that they were okay to cede rights to AI translations, because what we saw was it's basically like closed captioning, right? Like, you don't have to, when you produce a TV spot, you don't have to get talent to sign off on closed captioning. It's just expected to be part of it. And one of the things that we've seen is that when the talent actually speaks the language, that AI translation is much better. So I think if you're a host who speaks Spanish, or if you're a host who speaks German, your translation, your shows could actually be better. And then you'll probably negotiate some additional credits there, because you're just producing better content overall. So I think it's exciting that more people are going to have access to these big shows. I think it's also part of just like this globalization where we're all just getting a lot closer to each other, and our cultures are a little bit less different day to day. But it's exciting. I think this is a good thing.
I am looking forward to podcasts in other languages being AI translated into English. because that will be really interesting to have a listen to. Worth noting, I think also that YouTube has just formulated an AI policy as well. They have said that they now require disclosure about the use of AI in certain circumstances. And I think that the circumstances are interesting. There are 3 circumstances. One of them is if you use AI to make a real person say or do something they didn't say or do. So that if you're faking things, if you're altering footage of a real event or place, or if you're generating a realistic scene that didn't actually happen. So they're fine with AI for things like noise reduction, for things like translation, those sorts of things. But if you are using AI to essentially fake stuff, then you now have a button to press when you're uploading a video in YouTube so that you can actually, you know, fess up on that and make that very clear. And I think that that's a relatively sensible plan, really.
We're talking about such a small tentacle of the AI issue as it relates to podcasts, but it's so fascinating to see the whole world suddenly realizing we need to organize policies around how we manage this and how we keep it from getting out of control, and, you know, hopefully allowing humanity to survive a few more days or hours potentially, right? But I see this everywhere. You now, if you want to have a video generated by AI just by putting in some text prompts, that's going to be recorded. You cannot produce something, you know, seeing what happened with the royal family this past week, where very quickly people are starting to say, we need to know if something's being manipulated. And I think, as we've talked about it on this show, you know, I think that's what we've called for in our industry as well is, hey, look, there's great use cases. Foreign language translation is one of them. And there's a lot that AI is going to do to make the world better, which we want to embrace. But when you're taking trust and things that the ways that it will misrepresent people or their intentions or what they even know about, that's where it really requires these protections. So whether or not this is triggered by a union, seems like the government is too weak to create these types of policies as quickly as they're needed. I'm glad to see the private sector and unions stepping up to enforce some of these things, because we need regulation. We need some oversight here. So I see this as a very positive step in the right direction. James, you got something else on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, news out of Russia, the ISIS-K attack on the big theater in Moscow. What has happened on Russian TV is that they have used a deep fake of the Ukrainian head of security, a deep fake video of that person saying, "We did it, it's us to blame." Yeah. And Russian media have swallowed this and have been, you know, broadcasting it. So of course, Putin is there using that particular attack from ISIS-K as a excuse to keep on the war in Ukraine. I'm sure that we will see plenty more of these sorts of things as we move on in the year.
Sounds like weapons of mass destruction. By the way, we're getting more brand unsafe just by talking about these topics, because there's so much keywords that the AI is using to detect what the subject matter is. No, but this is important stuff, and so we'll keep an eye on this topic. Ricardo, there's an election this year, I'm told. While we're talking a little politics, what's happening in the advertising market?
Well, specifically, you know, it's interesting that James mentioned the news cycle, because like all the news properties are freaking out because they're not seeing a huge bump in election or investments around elections and news coverage right now. So everybody's kind of a little worried. I mean, traditionally, like people start investing heavily around election year and during the election cycles, because they know that there's going to be more eyeballs tuned in, more ears perked up, and they're not seeing it this year. As I think about the last midterm elections, you know, I didn't get bumped from clearance on a lot of properties. We just didn't see that same kind of level of investment. And so I do think that for this cycle, at least the presidential cycle, it may be a little bit of fretting that's premature. I mean, most people aren't tuned into election news yet. People will probably start tuning in August through the end of the year, through November. So it might just be early for the news properties to start seeing that bump. And ultimately, I think My hot take here is that some of these properties will get oversold, and we might see some clearance issues once we get into the general election. I mean, so far, there's really not been a lot of competition for the Democratic side, right? Everybody's supporting Biden for the most part. So there wasn't a lot of spend there. There has been tons of spend with Trump. I mean, Trump hasn't really been able to do tons of fundraising so far for the primaries. So as we move forward, I think we should see some increased spending there. I also do see that this is a slightly different election year in that, we're facing pretty gerrymandered districts across the country. So, if you're in a market that doesn't have a lot of competition, there's less need to spend. So it may be that there's maybe a little bit less pressure on used properties so early because of that. That's kind of what I'm seeing right now so far, though.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to how we're pacing for election spending that is directly, political ad buys. But I think what we have seen and what, Digiday just did a report on this, talking about how spend is just down on shows that are talking about the election. Like there is a bit of a recession happening with news and news talk properties. By the way, this is one of the key reasons that we started this podcast and got so involved in the brand safety and suitability issue. And I can't tell you that this is the only factor, but I do believe that brands and, Ricardo and Kristen, you guys are dealing with this all the time. You have to accommodate the sensitivities of the brands you represent, and you have to use the tools that are available to you to satisfy those sensitivities. And when nothing is safe, and when you have wildly unpopular leading candidates on both sides, and everything you're going to talk about feels like a liability, it gets really, really hard to attract brands, and larger brands keep coming into the space. Let's also remember that brand advertisers are now eclipsing performance marketers in terms of revenue contributed to the industry. So while we know that news and news talk genres and formats overperform for performance marketers, that is not a variable for all of the large Fortune 500 companies that are starting to come in and really pull the weight of the industry. And so consequently, news organizations, good ones and bad ones, are getting starved out as a byproduct of this. But the problem is, if you leave it all to the direct response advertisers, you're going to have more misinformation making the money from the performance marketers. It's going to be gold ads wall to wall and catheters and, the things you typically see on cable news, which everybody hates. And instead, the brands that need to be supporting the responsible discussions are nowhere to be found. This is why it is so, so important that we get away from just avoiding content based on keyword usage and look at for who is a responsible actor in the discussion, and that brands be bold and not afraid to sponsor responsible discussion of important topics. James, I'll give you the last word on this.
Yeah, the only other thing I would say, Dan, is that there are also elections in India and the UK this year, of course. So, it's not just the US which is having to grapple with all of this stuff.
See, I was born in America, so I think everything revolves around us. I get, but I'm glad that you're here to help remind me. It's the American way. So, well, anyway, be brave, support responsible content, no matter what country you're in. With that, Kristen, you have some moving off of sports and off of politics. Change the subject
And no
for
celebrities.
us, will you, please? No celebrities.
Yeah.
Well,
it'll come back into play. But Spotify has some happy news. They have hit the play button on music videos. And I actually stumbled upon this organically myself, as I am a Spotify user. They recently announced the beta launch of music videos on its app, both the app on your phone and the online website, starting with popular artists like Ed Sheeran and Ice Spice. This aligns with their broader strategy to evolve into an all-encompassing audio platform, showcasing its efforts in video features, AI-driven services, which The Ringer has now opted out of. And while Spotify's advertising business is under scrutiny for growth, integrating music videos is really, really cool. And it taps into like a very lucrative ad space. And so we're going to see them testing out probably how to monetize that. I think it's a great way to maybe pull over some of those YouTube kids who watch and consume all of their podcasts and all of their music on YouTube. Largely people are consuming like regular music on YouTube, even though it's a video playing, they're not paying attention, right? Now they can do the same thing with Spotify. And so they can tune into that music video, they can tune into the lyrics that, you know, come up like your karaoke, and, you know, just consume more and more information and more, you know, content on Spotify. Really our takeaway here is similar to eMarketer, who put out the article, is, you know, it's going to be initially a challenge to get consumers to engage, but I think, you know, it is exciting, you know, and we'll have to see what the consumer behavior is first.
I mean, I think it's interesting looking at, to me, it looks like a fight against YouTube Music. 100 million subscribers YouTube Music has versus Spotify's 236 million. So there's actually, you know, I mean, they're half the size, but they are half the size already. So I think that that's pretty interesting. I think one of the things, if you've used YouTube Music as a music app, pretty well anything that has ever had a music video is available in various quality on the YouTube Music app. And from that point of view, if you're a real fan, if you want to find weird and wonderful videos, weird and wonderful other mixes, then you will find it on that app as well. So I think that there's some pretty good you know, stuff in terms of that. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how Spotify plan to monetize that, and whether that's going to be a thing that they make available you know, in countries all over the world, or whether it's just going to be a thing that starts in the US, because, you know, rights for music videos is not an easy thing either.
Well, one thing I wonder is how much of this movement to push video into podcast distribution platforms like Spotify, how much of that just comes down to the cost of data getting cheaper to be able to distribute it? Wouldn't we have been doing this all along if the interface weren't so poor previously?
I mean, I think it's that, and also how you earn money out of that, because obviously an audio ad isn't necessarily going to work in the middle of a video podcast as well. So there's that kind of side of it as well. But, you know, Apple Podcasts has supported video for a long, long time. Spotify has a proprietary version, as is the Spotify way. And obviously YouTube supports it too. So I would suspect that we'll see more video, you know, coming up in terms of this area. Yeah.
It's getting muddier. It's getting muddier. So we talk a lot about save the live reads and why actually reading ads baked into a podcast is important versus just dynamically inserting things and having them all pre-produced and manufactured. And so it dawned on us that maybe we should eat some of our own cooking here and do live reads within the Media Roundtable podcast. And so here, 3 years plus later, since we first started doing the show, I'm going to present to you here today the first live read that we've ever done in this podcast. And I'm going to start with a question. Tell me if you've ever heard of these companies: Shopify, Bayer, Oracle, Indeed, Masterclass, Babbel, Tommy John. Any of these ringing a bell? You know, I don't just have the privilege of hosting the Media Roundtable, and a privilege it is, but I'm also the CEO of a company called Oxford Road, and we are the world's leading independently owned and operated ad agency specializing in audio. That means podcasts, radio, streaming, every permutation you can think of. If it's sound and it has ads in it, we try to get involved. And what that means is we help great companies worth fighting for, grow using audio. And that includes media buying and planning, analytics, attribution, insights. We have our own proprietary way of dealing with ad copy generation called Audiolytics, where we can actually score ads for their persuasiveness. And then we work with talent to customize those ads to make sure that they are authentic in the way that they're communicated. They communicate that. But audio is our passion here, and we want to lead this industry to new heights, which is why we've been really involved in brand safety and suitability, bringing solutions to market that can simplify the way that brands evaluate shows and incentivize responsible communication. That's why I'm always talking about the civility score, and we are trying to advance products like Seeker into the marketplace that we believe are helping solve some of these problems. Now, if you're a chief audio officer and you're looking to get the best in market performance at maximum viable scale, get in touch with us at oxfordroad.com. Or if you love audio and you're strategic, relentless, and looking for a career change, consider joining our mission as a fellow agent of influence and flip us your resume also at oxfordroad.com. And if you're working anywhere in the audio industry and you're serious about this business, go to oxfordroad.com. It's easy to spell. Sign up for our weekly newsletter. Even the great James Cridland reads The Influencer, and he is a competitor of sorts as the proprietor of very well-established newsletters in this industry. So just go to oxfordroad.com, sign up. You'll learn everything you need to know. And if you think of it and you like this podcast and what we're doing here, throw us a rating, throw us some comments. And if you don't have anything nice to say, email me at dan@oxfordroad.com. I'll make sure we process the feedback. Now, let's get back to some stories here. Kristen, there weren't enough celebrity names dropped in the last story. I'd like to come back to you so you could tell. It's not a podcast if there's not a celebrity name involved. So please.
Well, yeah, let me drop some celebrity names here. So celebrity podcasts, celebrity interview podcasts are not new. Mark Maron started his talking to his friends in his garage in 2009. Chris Hardwick started Nerdist in 2010, later became ID10T, and he did that up until 2022. And Nerdist / ID10T was like a regular place for celebrities on their press junkets until the show ended. Since those two started their podcasts in 2009 and 2010, respectively, we've had Smartless, Armchair Expert, arguably Joe Rogan Experience, Life is Short with Justin Long, Inside of You with Michael Rosenbaum, Family Trips with the Myers brothers. That would be Seth Meyers, in case anybody was mildly confused. So the list is relatively huge, right? And on top of the celebrity interview podcasts, you also have celebrities talking about, the shows that they're on, like all those look back, watch podcasts. So celebrities are all over the podcasting space. Some shows are better than others, arguably. The trick really here is finding ones where the host is genuinely curious and gets the guest to open up. Overall, the interview podcasts have been a trend among pop stars, politicians, royalty. We all know about Meghan Markle and Prince Harry and their Spotify deal that wasn't. And it offers a platform for brand building and soft power. However, there are concerns about the overall impact in the industry as they dominate the podcast landscape, potentially overshadowing other content formats and then raising questions about the art of interviewing. It's very, very important, I feel, when you're listening to celebrity interviews, that the hosts are able to make their guests comfortable and actively engage with them, and get them to open up, where the conversations are organic and not just part of, oh, I'm doing this press tour for such and such movie. I think the listeners definitely hear the difference, and that shows as well as in performance, because when you talk about shows where somebody's curious, like Armchair Expert, and they really get their guests to open up. Now you've got your listener who's really actively engaged in what they're listening to, versus a host who can't get their guests to open up. It's more stilted, it's more rote. And at that point, the listener now is kind of like stepping back from the experience, and it becomes a little bit more background noise. And I think we see that in performance for certain shows with certain guests on air. So overall, I think, it's not necessarily a detriment to the podcast industry to have a proliferation of celebrity interviews. I think it's just how they go about doing it is going to be the ultimate, big question.
So my question for all of you is, do you feel, so going back to one of the points that you made, that celebrities sometimes get a pass and can overshadow because they come in with a name, somebody that might actually be better at the craft. But my question to you guys is, do you feel that podcast is still a meritocracy where over time, the bad ones really don't continue to get monetized and the cream rises to the top? Or do you believe that some of the most successful shows are not actually deserving of being there over a sustained? We know everybody gets an initial bump, but do they get to stay there if they're not good? And do they stay there, or do they get there if they are good eventually?
I think that the ones who are going to be good at this are going to be worth the money over a longer period of time. And the ones who aren't, I think we'll see them go away in a year, maybe two. Armchair Expert didn't get the deal with Spotify that they did because they weren't good at what they were doing. And I think that show in particular shows longevity. There's other celebrity podcasts that, out the gate, they did really well, but over time, I think you're going to see that decay in listeners just because they're not able to either commit the way that Armchair Expert has. I mean, Dax Shepard, I think he's a special case, right? He doesn't really act anymore. He's focused all of his energy into his podcast. There's other ones that aren't able to make that same commitment. So I think there will be decay in listenership. And then there's ones who are just not as good at the craft who also see that same issue.
Look, I think there was forces driving people to sign up for these podcast opportunities, right? Like there was all this like industry consolidation. There was these big contracts announced, so everybody wanted to cash in. If you're a musician, like you're not making your money off of music sales, you're making your money off of concerts and appearances and potentially podcasts. So it was a good avenue for them to pursue. But ultimately, I think podcast is about authenticity and that connection you have with your audience. So hosts that are smart, hosts that are engaged with their audience, hosts who know who they're talking to and can be authentic, I think those are the ones that we're going to see thrive and continue doing well for us in the long run. J-Lo just produced a big documentary that she's self-funded that everybody's making fun of and flopping. And mostly it's because people think she's maybe a little fake. I don't think she'd do great with a podcast. So I think, the more authentic you are, the more your audience can connect you, the stronger possibilities you have to be a long presence in the podcast space.
Well, and I'd like to think the economics of it are starting to support what you guys are saying, which is, yes, it is still a meritocracy over time. Now, of course, you'll see somebody leverage their name, get an initial spike, and maybe get a contract. But at some point, they need a renewal on that contract. And listeners aren't stupid. They have a lot of choices. And they might check you out, but they're probably not going to stay if you're not actually good at the craft. So I'd like to believe that this place remains about who does the best work. And, if they're famous, that's great. If they're coming in with respect for the platform and they really are going to put into it, then they can get something out. But the folks that just saw it as easy money and they'd be Joe Rogan if they tried it for 5 minutes because they were famous. I'd like to believe that that's continuing to work itself out of the system. We'll see. Final story. We're going to throw to our friend from across the pond, even though he's in LA with us today. Giles, why don't you tell us what's happening with the BBC?
Well, they've struck a deal with Amazon Music to bring a selection of their podcasts to listeners in the US. 50 podcasts is what has been announced, including shows such as Americast, BBC Global News, Planet Premier League, etc. So not insignificant content. And I think this is an interesting development. There was actually another story this same week, I think, where they're announcing that they're selling advertising on podcasts in the UK that are not on BBC platforms, so not on BBC Sounds, for example. But if you're listening on Apple or other third-party apps, you'll start to hear ads in BBC content, which is something of a seismic shift for listeners in the UK, as the BBC has, obviously never taken advertising within the UK before. It was interesting hearing them present at Radio Days. The BBC Sounds team was there, and it's clear that it's hard being a sort of national public broadcaster in a world funded only by a license fee that continually leaves a funding gap in a world where Spotify is increasingly dominating music content, and the fight for spoken word content is increasingly difficult and bitter, with again Spotify obviously getting a lot of traction in Europe there, but it's also a great opportunity for marketers, particularly in the US, to associate themselves with the BBC name and some of this excellent content on Amazon. And if you look through some of the great content that the BBC has available, I mean, we were just actually doing a project for one of our international advertisers, B2B brands, and looking across the BBC portfolio, they have leading podcasts from BBC Radio 5, the sports channel, from BBC World Service, BBC Radio 4. Like, there's just a ton of top business and finance related content, particularly across the whole globe. So it's a great opportunity for marketers to get associated with this quality content. And yeah, I mean, it's I think causing some real shockwaves in the UK, and also presenting some fairly interesting existential type questions. At which point I think I might hand over to James.
Yeah, I mean, there are all kinds of policy questions. I worked for the BBC for 2 years, and my goodness, there must have been a number of conversations going on behind closed doors about this. Policy questions probably not too interesting for this podcast, but one thing I would point out is that potentially, at least, listens on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and other things will earn the corporation a lot of money in comparison to BBC Sounds, which will remain ad-free. So does that make the listener on Apple Podcasts more valuable to the BBC? I would probably posit that it does. So I think that that's certainly interesting. I suppose the question for the audio creative officer, the creative audio officer, is: are you going to be advertising on these things? And who is actually going to be selling it? My guess is it will be Acast. Acast sells the BBC outside of the UK. So Acast will probably sell the BBC within the UK. That would make most sense, given that it's already got the tech set up, it's got the know-how and everything else. Secondly, what will you get? You will not get live reads. I'll tell you that for now. You will only get pre-promoted, pre-made 30-second ads and those sorts of things. So, that's what you will get. And you won't necessarily get that in all of their shows. They have said that they won't be putting ads on news shows, which is a bit weird because they have the BBC News Channel, which has ads on it. And they've got, the BBC website, which has ads on it. So quite why they're not putting ads on the podcast versions, who knows? But still, fascinating to watch, and fascinating to find out who actually goes out and sells this. But I think great news for people that want access to some of the BBC's content within the UK, that might be available by the end of next year, by the sounds of things.
Well,
yeah, having tried to buy BBC for years, like, this is a super exciting change for us. I look forward to be able to place something there for some of our advertisers. It's going to open up a whole other opportunity for addressing the UK market. It's really exciting.
I got nothing to add, guys. Wonderful recap, wonderful show. Thank you for joining the Media Roundtable. And this podcast is brought to you by Oxford Road, where we want you to succeed in audio and use your influence for good. If you're a marketer looking to align your brand values with extraordinary business outcomes, reach out to our agency, oxfordroad.com, by visiting oxfordroad.com and subscribing to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer. Also, don't forget to listen to Ad Infinitum. It is Oxford Road's audio creative focused podcast hosted by our very own Stu Redwine, VP of Creative Services. Start at episode 1, and you'll get a great understanding of what makes audio ads work and how to make them better. And he just goes deeper and deeper into the audio sphere from there. So special thank you to our guests, Ricardo, James, Kristen, Giles, and of course, Bianca, Kyle, Haley, Ezra, Mary Jane, Everett, Neil, and the team at Podcast One. So many people helping make this possible. As always, influence responsibly.